today's tutorial, I'm going to be kind of showing how I basically test bass presets. What basically what I do, a chain that I set up, or something similar that I set up on my bass channel, so that I can quickly skim through presets and see what works, or so that I can quickly design a sound which immediately fits in with the rest of the mix. Because I think often you'll be flicking through and these presets will be quite quiet, or they'll have quite nasty high end, or there's loads of different things that might happen which might actually put you off a preset. It's not to say that there won't be rubbish. Like, you'll still have to skim through stuff, but this chain kind of makes things stand out a bit more. So this is basically the chain, which I'll go through in a bit more depth. But you've got an EQ first, compressor, a sidechain compressor, saturator, and a filter. So this is like a rough chain that I use. And I make tweaks too, obviously depending on the preset that you're using. And it's balanced with the kick as well. So if I just play the bass line that I used using a plugin called Blue, and I'll keep the chain on. So yeah, it's quite an analog preset. What I normally do as well with these bass, whenever I've got a bass plugin, I hit this configure and I basically map it to the frequency, the resonance, and the envelopes, so that I can, because a lot of these presets will have the cutoff quite high, which you don't in particular need for a bass sound. You can have it very far down and then have like the resonance up, so it's boosting at that frequency. So if I just turn this off, so that might have been what I had, and I will dial it down to lower, so it's really subby. So if I just go over the chain, I have an EQ first, which you typically have first on most instruments, because it might not seem like there's something to get rid of, but there's always something to get rid of. Some of these presets come with sounds that fill the spectrum, and if you've got a bass sound, the likelihood is you're not going to need much high end. So you can properly cut it. I could have even done at 1K. Like I said, this is very dependent on the samples you're using and preset. So like the idea is that you would be flicking through presets with this chain on or something similar. Like it's kind of like a rough chain, which obviously you refine when you're mixing. So yeah. So typically I would be looking to do a high cut in this region, a low cut below 40-ish, because that's like the very subby region. And this particular kind of bass doesn't really have, it has sub, but not as low as below 40. So that's where it can get quite muddy. Then, so that would be in terms of cutting, in terms of, well, and then, so high pass and low pass filters typically I would do quite a lot on most instruments with the bass. The next cut is kind of around the 100 mark, and that's a lot of the time the kick punches through at 100, so I would be looking to duck at that kind of level. Then I just do this. Another issue when you're flicking through presets is that the bass can lack presence, because a bass is typically low. But like, if I don't know if you've used like Operator and you've used just a sine wave, you need higher harmonics for that to come through, which is why people are often recommending applying like saturation and stuff, is what I've got in my chain later on. But you can also try to bring out some of these upper frequencies using EQ. So I'd boost there, and then depending on your sound, you might want to boost a bit. Like that. Basically bring out, because you've eliminated 100, so you want to make it up elsewhere. So yeah, I'd have an EQ, then a compressor, which is essentially evening out the dynamic range, which is good to have on a bass line. Want it to be solid, unless you're intending for have a wide dynamic range, but you like your bass to be consistent. So these settings are just how I put them. Then I would have sidechain, because without it, depending on how you've drawn your bass line, so you'll see clash. Ideally, if you write a bass line, you don't want it to be clashing with a kick. So the ideal scenario is not to write bass notes where the kick would be. But if you can't help that, and if you have, you can still make it work. If I just make it really extreme, so yeah, basically a lot of depending on how you've written your bass line, it might, when you're testing it with a kick, it might not fit with that pattern. But when you're sidechaining it, it's ducking to make room for the kick. So if you've got that sidechain compressor already on that channel, ready to go when you're making a bass line, it allows you to get a better context. Next, I have a plugin called Decapitator by Santoys. I use it a lot. It's basically a saturation analog hardware model. So similar to like Ableton's saturator drum bass. You can basically alter its drive, which boosts its upper harmonics. And this particular plugin, you can flick between a darker sound, which is a lot more bassy, and a brighter sound, which is the opposite. So yeah, like I said with the basses, like often, especially if you're just flicking through presets at the beginning, they lack that high end. And especially if you make cuts to the high end. If you're making cuts, then having that distortion can bring out basically what you've taken away, but in a nicer way, I guess. So this this can be like distortion, saturation, that kind of thing. Anything that you can use to basically brighten up the sound once you've ID'd it up, altered its dynamics, made it duck out of the way of the kick. So anything you can do to basically make it punch through in the mix. So yeah, this is just any one plugin you can use, but you can use like anything. And then finally, I'd have one of, or maybe both of, an EQ, something similar to this, but basically looking to see what else you can do. Can you bring much more out? Can you cut? I'd always be looking to cut, ideally, but so yeah, I'd have maybe another EQ, and finally an auto filter, doing, which is kind of like for the arrangement. So like you could simulate a build, like a pre-drop, and then you could put this on. So yeah, basically take out the lows, and then when the drop hits, you bring it all in again. That's why I've got an auto filter. So in essence, this is the chain. This is like a similar kind of chain that I'd have on pretty much every bass channel I use. Basically to give more context while I'm looking through presets and stuff. So if I just show this, how I'd use it. So I'd have the pattern drawn in. This is the same pattern I used before. I would have this kind of chain on. Bear in mind that this chain doesn't apply to every single preset, and obviously depends on what kick you're using. So like I found this when the chain's not on. But the chain basically is designed to clean up the sounds, to boost the volume, to give it room in the mix with the kick and make it stand out. That's basically the chain's purpose. So like if I play it with it's quite subby. The kick's quite high as well. So I'm ducking around like the 100 to 150 mark. Basically let the kick through, even though it's quite a good kick sample. If I was speaking from more like of a general standpoint, that's where I'd be looking straight away. And then this sample's not as subby, so you can't really boost anything. And I can probably take more off. So in terms of like the compression, basically quite a quiet preset, so I'd normally use compression to beef it up a bit. Saturation, sidechain. I don't want it ducking that much. So dial in. But yeah, that's sounding fine to me. In terms of like the EQ, I don't think I need that. And then I would always have a filter at the end. So yeah, that's pretty much how I would set up a bass channel so that I could test presets quickly. Instead of that like kind of tedious process where you're trying to kind of balance the act of drawing in a bass line and finding a preset that works with your kick, where you're basically flicking between the two, drawing between and trying to find a preset that works. Why not just find something to begin with, like an analog from Ableton, write a rough pattern, put these kind of effects on the strip, and then flick through them and give yourself kind of an easier decision to make in terms of how you choose those sounds. So yeah, that's pretty much gonna be it for this one. I hope that helped some of you just get a better idea of what should be on a chain, or kind of how to speed up your workflow on that in that sense. Be sure to copy this chain, at least in terms of the effects, and obviously dial in the parameters to taste. And gonna leave that one there. Hope you enjoyed.